Hey, Busy 505 students, Patrick Vernon here, PV, be your professor for the semester. And I wanted to do a quick video to make sure Busy 505 fits your expectations. To start, the title of the class is a little confusing because frankly, it's kind of not a thing. Entrepreneurial consulting is not really a career path per se. There's sort of two different things, a little bit of oil and water with entrepreneurship and consulting. If you think about it, when you think of consulting, it's a perfect fit at the business school, high level strategic thinking, macro level, well educated, like you can see, corporate smart folks in airplanes flying around thinking high level strategy. When you think about entrepreneurship, it's a little more like the maverick building a company one customer at a time, very involved, very passionate. They're not completely different. They have a lot of things in common, in fact, and these are things that are in common with this class as well. First and foremost, they're strategic thinkers. This is a strategy class. And we'll have a big strategic problem to be working on. And both founders and consultants have to use frameworks so that they can come up with a persuasive narrative about what they're going to do in this complicated strategic scenario. And to do that, we incorporate everything from the business curriculum. So you need to bring everything you've learned from core curriculum classes, and we've got to figure out a way to infuse those into a strategy. Our big project for this class is to find a growth strategy for a startup. So we're going to be, just like consultants and just like founders, utilizing these other buckets here, frameworks, persuasive narratives, using the entire curriculum. One extra challenge for business school students is translating what I will call corporate speak into startup speak. We've got to take things that we've learned in our classes, which are really designed for Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 businesses, and translate those into sort of the startup ecosystem, if you will. And that's a big challenge for a lot of business school students. And so just keep that in mind. It's not consulting, but it's not really management consulting. We're not talking Fortune 500 here. We're talking startup. And just as an example, if you look over here, I know segmentation, a lot of business school students would think, millennials is a segment. Well, millennials is not a segment to startups. That's a whole market. A segment to startups is more like a micro niche as you're building your company one by one. Say sophomores at state universities, that would be a niche. How are we going to do this? It's going to be experiential education. You're probably aware that you get EE credit for this class. And the way we're going to do it is a little simulation where you're going to play the startup team. You'll pretend to be the founders of a startup. And like a Y Combinator accelerator, you've got a whole cohort of other startups in this class. So you put those together, and it's sort of like our Busy 505 SimCity startup, with the caveat, this looks way more fun than it's going to be. It is a business school class, so it's not a video game. It's going to be a business school class, but we are going to run a simulation. And the game is, we'll find a startup and form teams around the startups. And so take a look at your first homework assignment on Canvas. This is due the first day of class. So there is homework before the first day of class. It's kind of an icebreaker, a little bit about yourself. And then I'm going to ask you all to go out and identify one startup. This doesn't have to be your final choice for the semester. In fact, we will be forming teams. So only about a third of the startups that get submitted for that homework might even get used in this class. If you already have a startup in mind, you might have somebody in your family or in your network, or even yourself working on a startup. That could be a good topic. What you're seeing here are projects we've done in former years. In the homework assignment, I give you a bunch of links of different places you could go find startups. And it's really up to you. Bring in any kind of startup. It can be any stage, although I do think the class works best for early stage. So if it's something that's nationally known, or if it has more than 10 million in revenue, or has raised more than 10 million, those are probably a little bit bigger than are perfect for this class. I mean, it could still work. Entrepreneurship is all about exceptions. So bring whatever you want to that first class period, and we will begin discussing it, and we'll begin getting teams together. So first is that startup you'll submit, and then we're also going to be forming teams. And ideally, these teams will be 3 to 4 students. Occasionally, I will allow a 5-person team, although that is not very functional. And occasionally, I will allow a 2-person team, although it's tricky if we have 25 in the class because I can't have 12 projects. There are a couple of approaches you might be taking as you get a team together. One is you may be really excited about a startup you found or that you already know about, in which case you should take an active role in trying to recruit people to your team. And again, you'll need to recruit, say, 2 other people, so you have a team of at least 3. Or a couple of you might be familiar with something. Or you might just see a startup somebody else has, or you're a little more go with the flow and you can join a team. These are going to be happening in class and online discussions, and will be done during the second week of class. So very soon we're going to have these together, and it starts with this first homework assignment due before you arrive at first class. So once we've got teams together going out of that second week of class, you are the founding team. Obviously the startup has its own founders, but what we will be doing in our sim city is pretending that you are the founding team. That means you're saying we and not they. It's not their startup, it's your startup. What would you do next? That is your big strategic question for the entire semester long project. Find a growth strategy. That's your strategic project. And that by that, I mean, what would you do next if it were your startup? And if you look at all these things here, marketing, operations, communications, it could be any of those things. Maybe maybe they're communicating something poorly. Maybe they're not marketing the way you would market. It will depend on your team's core competencies, and it'll depend on how much you learn about the value network of your startup, what direction you go. But it will be up to your team to find that direction. And you'll hear me say a lot in this class, to find your voice as a team, as a startup team. You're the founding team. What would you do next? This is different than consulting in that we're not going to treat the startups as a client. So you don't have to try to decide what you think they would do next. You're going to try to do, if this were your startup, what would you do? So here's kind of a snapshot of what this class is sort of like, right? We are utilizing frameworks and creating narratives and using the whole curriculum in a simulation where you're the founding team. So that means it's maybe not the best for management consulting students who just want another consulting class. This is really focused on startups. I mean, it uses a lot of consulting stuff. So some students feel like BUSI 554 was really helpful because it helps them create narratives and use frameworks. Others find it was harmful because they're so locked into corporate speak, it's hard to translate into entrepreneurship. Ultimately, I'm hoping that you will leave this class with better tools to answer this question in case at some point in your career, one of your classmates or colleagues says, hey, you want to quit and join my startup? And you might even be that person. This test drive, this simulation we'll do in BUSI 505 will help you answer that question. So that gets us into specific learning outcomes of this class. There are 4 major buckets. And number 1 is learning how to juggle. And not just startups, obviously management teams and consulting teams have to juggle. There are too many, I mean, business school students have to juggle, right? But it is exaggerated on startup teams. And one thing that's different about startups is there's less control. You might be, as a founder, the captain of this hot air balloon, but it depends on which way the air blows, the wind blows. And that can really be, that doesn't fit everybody. Not everybody's up for that level of ambiguity. Some people thrive in it and some people do not. So that's one thing you'll learn in this class at this stage in your life. How much are you interested, for example, in the next year or two, taking on that level of ambiguity and that level of risk and unknown? Because the ups and downs in startups tend to be exaggerated, right? On the upside, you could become amazingly wealthy. And on the downside, you could go bankrupt. For the class, the ups are kind of similar in that you have autonomy and you're working on a real world project, so that this, things you do come up with could get implemented by your startup. I mean, you might even go work at the startup, who knows? It might even be your startup for that matter. There's high risk and return in these projects, but on the downside, it can be very frustrating for some students who are used to, of course, lectures and right and wrong answers. The word rudderlessness comes up a lot with students. They're not sure how to do this. And it is a heavy workload. So this is a microcosm of what it's like to be on a startup team. So that is why the class is structured in such a way. And I want you to notice that this downside piece can be really hard on some students, where you've been taught for years and years, if you make a mistake, that's a problem. So understand that it's not necessarily a problem. This is experiential education, and that is not sitting and learning, it's being actively involved. And that means, in part, it can be frustrating when not everything is going to be going up the whole time. The good news, there's no textbook, there are not very many lectures, but the bad news is your engagement is required. You got to really get actively involved in these projects. And part of that is that up and down thing, by the way, is handled a little bit by the lean process. If you've had any other startup classes or entrepreneurship classes, you've heard of lean startup. And I'll dumb it down to this simple concept, which is you have an idea or a hunch, or for lean startup, they often talk about a minimum viable product. You test it, and then you iterate based on the feedback that you get. And we will be doing that in our class in BUSI 505 with your ideas for growth strategies. We're going to test those and iterate those throughout the semester. And if you think about it, why do you iterate anything? You iterate because it's not right. There's something that needs to get corrected. And so you might think of this lean process as a cure for the downs. Iteration means, in other words, pivot, means you need to change something. It means something was wrong. And wrong is not wrong. Wrong is just a part of the process. Iteration is a part of the process, and that gets you to new, better hunches or new, better products, a new, better understanding of the world. Those are all good things. It's just kind of a hard process because you have to learn by doing. You hear the phrase fail fast and iterate, right? Do it quickly, learn as much as you can. Don't think of it as failure. It's moving forward. You sometimes hear it called fail forward. Not, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. We thought that people were going to hate blank, and then we went out and talked to people and it turns out they love it, or the opposite. Both of those, you can't take it personally. It is a part of the process. Imagine if Edison bailed at step number 1900 on the way to the light bulb. Like his attitude was, I never failed. It just took a long, long time and a lot of steps. Our class will be kind of like that. Sometimes it's going to feel like you failed. But understand that's just a part of the process. That's the part of the learning process. It's a part of the lean process. And once you get used to it, you start to have a better attitude about it and you're more productive, including when I come to your study room and I say, hey, did you think of this or did you think of that? And your team might be like, oh no, we made a mistake. You didn't make a mistake. You're in progress. It's a part of the process. And that process gets a bunch of data. What we're going to be doing all semester is accumulating data so that you can become better data analysts and learn to tell those stories. Your persuasive stories are most persuasive when you have data or evidence to support your arguments, and you incorporate those into your storyline, right? I would also maybe call this less BS. To some extent, corporate speak can sometimes, often to entrepreneurs and to venture capitalists, corporate speak sounds like BS because it's so high level and so broad, it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. We're really going to get into the weeds and get very specific. You're going to get your own quote unquote data. And a lot of times means talking to people, interviews. What did people say? That's a kind of data. We're not going to be working with huge spreadsheets of downloaded customer data or anything like that. We're going to go through this data collection process where you will be doing lots of interviews, for example, and I'll coach you through this process, but this will get you through. In the beginning, we've kind of got best guesses, and midterm was sort of have an early data indicates or the evidence seems to point to. And in the end, we'll have findings through this investigative process. Because you will be gathering the data, you will become a more compelling storyteller because it's something you actually believe in. I often tell students that, look, you're the founding team and pretend you're pitching this to your rich aunt or your grandfather, somebody in your family or somebody in your personal network that might fund your startup for $100,000. You need to really believe the things you're saying, and you need to say them very convincingly and specifically. To do that, I think it helps if you think a little bit more like a journalist as opposed to what we normally do in the business school. We're going to be building on our business school skills, and we're going to be adding this level of entrepreneurship, if you will. So if you think about a journalist, they have a hunch or a story idea, and then they go interview a bunch of people, and then they iterate the story, and they report what the world said. Right? But that reporting came from their early hunch, iterated through their interviews. You'll go through that similar process, and it's very different than what we do for case studies, for example, or what we did in business communications, where you're given a problem. You kind of just come up with solutions based on what you've learned in classes and your experience, and then you create a beautiful PowerPoint supporting the hunches you had. I often call this study room strategy. And that's really important. And we're really good at that in the business school. But what we'll be adding to that in this class is you'll actually be going out and interviewing people, and you're not going to fall in love with your early hunches. Your study room hunches are kind of meaningless. They're just a beginning of the process. What you want to do is find out what is really happening in the world and report that back. So we're going to work like a lean journalist. We're going to have these early hunches. We're going to go interview people and understand what the industry and market look like. And we will have a story at the end. It's not lofty corporate speak that could be interpreted as BS. The last thing I want to talk about is a learning outcome from BUSI 505 as being a real team player. And maybe I should change that to being more like a founding or startup team player. In corporate America, we obviously divide and conquer. And of course, in all your classes, when you have teamwork, you divide and conquer. And to some extent, we'll do a little dividing and conquer in this class. But startup teams very much all do everything. They have positions to play and roles to play, but everybody's involved in each aspect of it. And I will require that of your team as well. You're not going to divide this project into different buckets and then slap it together and sort of glue it and MacGyver it together with super glue and duct tape at the end. You're all going to be involved in every aspect of the project. So really, at the end, each of you could individually give the final presentation. I could give the final presentation. We will all be so deeply involved in it. Through that process, you'll have a team vision and a team voice. Earlier I mentioned you're finding a growth strategy. What would you do next? All three of you or four of you have to kind of come up with that vision together. And there can be some disagreement. And in fact, there should be, and that's this last bucket here. You need to trust each other enough. You need to be meeting often enough and having deep discussions. And in fact, I'm going to require that you meet outside of class every week. So there's no textbook, there's no outside reading, but there is a lot of outside work, including meeting every week, so that you get to a level you can trust each other to have conflict. Because if startup teams don't have conflict internally and work through those as a team, they're going to get beaten up in the markets. You can't take a product to market having not thought it all the way through. So we'll simulate that in BUSI 505. And the simulation in our case often is me coming to your study room and saying, have you thought of this? Have you thought of this? Have you thought of this? And you, by the end of the semester, should be answering, oh yeah, we've thought about all that. We've talked about it. There's not always an answer. That can be a struggle for a lot of students. A lot of times, yeah, we've thought about it and there's no right answer. It might go this way or it might go that way. And startups work in that environment all the time where we don't know, but we have thought about it and we are prepared to iterate. Our current thinking is blank and we're prepared to iterate in case blank happens. And you got to think through all those scenarios. This is about being on the founding team, not being a consultant to the founding team. So once again, in our SimCity simulation, you're going to be pretending to be the founding team. You're figuring out what you want to do next. And we're not doing client relationship kind of work here. So you'll actually only meet the client. You'll meet your startup founders about 5 weeks, 4 or 5, maybe 4 weeks into the class, and you don't meet them again until your final presentation. And that's by design. It seems counterintuitive, but it's by design. I keep you separated from them so that you can come up with your own strategy. And frankly, that means you're going to have better work for them because you're going to work harder on your own vision. That autonomy is really important. So think about these learning outcomes. They may not be perfect for you, if you were planning to be a management consultant and really not that interested in entrepreneurship. Also, I should share with you what is shared with me by former students. It is a heavy workload. I'm told it's not as bad as BUSI 554 consulting skills and frameworks, but similar. They often say it's worth it because it is a real life project. And so it really has a specific meaning and outcome that is worth it, which speaks to this middle bucket as well. There's something really tangible here to talk about in interviews. You are going to have some challenges. There are going to be some downs in BUSI 505 for you and your team. And that gives you a good fodder for interview materials, tangible things you can talk about. And lastly, and this maybe should be first because I get this a lot, is the most intense team experience. This is not one where you just divide and conquer and slap it together. As I've mentioned, everybody has to be engaged. We will talk about grade expectations along the way. So we're all going to be very clear on, look, you need to be stepping up. And it includes, by the way, that you have to be doing the homework week in and week out. This is not a class where you can let it build up and then make it happen at the end. So keep all of that stuff in mind. Because of the workload, don't take 554 or STAR. You need to either drop those or drop this. They're just not good to take at the same time, partly because of the workload and also partly because of the language. We will be translating those lessons into the startup ecosystem. Think about all of these things as you consider if you want to stay in 505. We may have people on the wait list, so it's helpful if you drop sooner than later. This bottom right one is really important, a startup that you're excited about. Feel free to come to the first class period or do that first homework assignment. In that homework assignment, you will get a chance to see and you'll be required to reply to your classmates. So you'll see all the startups that are submitted. And if there's not one in there that excites you, then drop the class because you're gonna spend the whole semester on some startups. So it's important that there is something that you can get excited enough about to work all semester. All right, I hope this was helpful. I will see you in class next week or tomorrow, depends on when you watch this video. And I really look forward to working with you if you do want to stay in BUSI 505, but I hope you are staying for the right reasons. And signing off.